We talked about the similarities, and the similarities usually are not a problem. Everybody kind of agrees with the similarities and they show similarities, but the differences cause people problems, okay? This is called the synoptic problem. What do you do with the differences, okay? And so one of the differences will be the ordering of events. The ordering of events. And this is, I think, significant. The temptation of Christ. Do you remember the temptation of Christ? Christ, in almost all the Gospels, where it starts right out, Jesus, the Spirit of God, comes and takes Christ out into the wilderness. Where he's fasting 40 days, 40 nights out in the wilderness. Okay, this temptation sequence. In Matthew and Luke. Luke 4, Matthew 4. Temptation of Christ. Okay, here's the order. Both of these Gospels start out with Satan comes up to Jesus and says, Jesus, hey, you hungry? Turn those rocks into bread. And Jesus says, what? Man does not live by bread alone. Jesus quotes from Deuteronomy. Actually, all 3 times Satan tempted him, he quotes from Deuteronomy 4 to, I think it's chapter 11 or chapter 8, something like that in that section from chapter 4 on in Deuteronomy. So both gospel writers start out with the rocks to bread. Now you say there's no problem there. That's right, no problem there. What about the second one? In Matthew, it says that Satan took Jesus up to the pinnacle of the temple and basically said, Jesus, hey, the Psalms say that if you throw yourself down, that his angels will bear you up, lest you dash your foot up on a stone. And Jesus turns and says, don't tempt the Lord your God. Again, out of Deuteronomy. Satan's quoting Scripture here, as I think we mentioned before. Satan actually quotes Scripture and says, pinnacle, jump off the pinnacle, and his angels will bear you up. But what's interesting is, Luke, on the other hand, talks about the kingdoms that Satan takes him for the second temptation, takes him up to the mountain, and to the high point of the mountain, shows him all the kingdoms of the world and says, I will give all these things to you if you'll bow down and worship me. And Jesus says, you shall worship only the Lord your God. Again, quoting from Deuteronomy. So here's the kingdoms that up on top of the mountain shows him the kingdoms of the world, worship me and stuff. So you can see that the order is different, and sure enough, they both finished. There's 3 temptations, and each one of these have 3 temptations. Okay? But the 3 temptations, numbers 2 and 3, are switched, are flipped. So Matthew ends with Jesus being taken up to the mountain and shown all the kingdoms of the world, and says, all these kingdoms I'll give you if you bow down and worship me. And Jesus says, no, worship God only. Matthew ends with the kingdoms, whereas Luke ends with the pinnacle jump. Jump off this pinnacle, and and his angels will bear you up. So all I'm saying is, the 3 temptations of Christ, when he's tempted by Satan in the wilderness, numbers 2 and 3 are flip-flopped. The order is different. So which one is the actual order? Which one is the actual historical order? Now, I want to bring another thing into this. Is it possible that the writer is using the order of this temptation of Christ in order to make a statement, in order to fit? In other words, did the writer fit his story? Did the writer fit his story to the environment of what he's trying to say? And what I'm wanting to suggest is, yes, do you guys realize storytelling, okay? When a person tells a story, do they tell it in different ways depending on the audience that they're addressing? We have this guy at Gordon College named Dr. Graham Bird. He's a pianist who plays classical piano. He's an incredible pianist. He's also a classical scholar, studies Homer and Greek and that kind of thing, as well as a linguist, and also involved in computers. He's kind of a Renaissance kind of person. They still have some of those people left in the world. And it's very interesting. He sits down and he calls it jazz, okay? And so he sits down with this metaphor on jazz. And so what happens is he'll play something like, let's take a song like Amazing Grace. Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. And so he'll play it. And what he'll do is then he'll take the song Amazing Grace and he'll play it in a classical style, in the style of kind of Beethoven or Mozart. And all of a sudden you'll hear him doing his little playing, and it will sound, you will recognize that it's Amazing Grace, but you will recognize also that he's playing it like it was a classical piece. And then, all of a sudden, he will switch and play that from Amazing Grace, played as a classical piece, and then all of a sudden, he'll switch and play Amazing Grace as if it's a gospel song in a kind of a First Baptist church and stuff, and he'll start beating on the piano and start playing Amazing Grace like it would be in a Baptist church kind of context. And then, all of a sudden, he'll change, again, you recognize both classically that it was Amazing Grace, and when it was played as a gospel kind of song, Amazing Grace, and then all of a sudden, he'll turn it into jazz. And it's almost like you're down in New Orleans and this guy is out on the street side there playing this song, Amazing Grace. Now, by the way, do you recognize it as it's jazz? You recognize immediately that it's jazz, but you also recognize that the song is Amazing Grace. Now, each one of those was Amazing Grace, but they were played totally differently, and you can see he could play in a classical audience, he would play it this way. In a gospel audience, he would play it this way. If you're down in New Orleans, he'd play it this way. Same song, but different. And anybody that's taught much, when I was younger, I taught at a Bible college down in Bristol, Tennessee, and I was a pastor, preaching at like 5 different churches, and so I had like 5 churches, and every week I would go to a different church and preach. Okay, so it was like a circuit rider preacher, and so I would go from one church to the next, and would go 5, and then I'd go around like that. So what happened is I developed a sermon. And I would preach the sermon. Now, at the first church, I would preach it, and then next week, I would preach the same sermon at a different church. A third time, I would preach at a third church, fourth and fifth church. I'd preach the same sermon 5 weeks and do it at 5 different churches, 5 different audiences. Now, question, each time I preached the sermon, was it the same sermon? It was the same sermon all 5 times, but my wife would go with me to these various churches and things, and she'd always say, the first time you preached it, it was pretty terrible, okay? And so, okay, you go off the first time, she says, the first time is down, you didn't really have it together and stuff. She said it got much better the second time. She said the third time, you were the best. The third time, you had really honed it, and you preached it really well. She said by the 4th and 5th time, she said, especially the 5th time, she said, I could tell you were bored with your own sermon. And so there was kind of like a crescendo coming up. It was terrible initially. It got better. And finally I got it right. And then after I got it right, it was downhill from there. And so I'm saying is the same sermon preached in 5 different churches. Did I ever use exactly the same words? Some. But with each church were the stories a little different and things get tweaked a little bit. Some depended upon the audience interaction and some depended on my crafting of the sermon to a different level, editing it again. And things. And so all I'm saying is it's possible to tell the same story several different ways. This has also come up. My son got back from Afghanistan and he tells stories, and I've heard his stories now told several times. And it's been very interesting. Each time he tells a story, he tells it one time to his brothers and sisters, and he tells a story and everybody's laughing, rolling on the floor. It's just that he's an amazing storyteller. And he tells a story and it's really humorous. The children leave the audience and the thing, and then he talks just to my wife and I, and then he tells us the same story, but with totally different meaning, and just drops some really, really heavy stuff. And it's the same story, but told with different effect.